Gorh maithagad a hirdig agus bhainm a dúspáir mo bhuichas a gháil de John Mulholland agus an cúis an cuire bheilih a ríist a nocht agus mo go gádagus a dhéanamh le gach aine a ghlachan páirt in agrú na seachtainna seo mar seachtain an a hochtach é mar le cuasaí polasathe na tíre agus buna man tanavas chomá. 2016 will be an important year for our country. I have no doubt that the Irish people will embrace the commemoration of the founding event of our Republic with enthusiasm. It will be a moment of both celebration and reflection. The Republican tradition of 1916 is one that any country should be proud of. The proclamation remains a remarkable document for its lack of rancour, its promotion of equality, and its demand for a nationalism which is generous and outward-looking. Most of all, this will be the centenary of an event which was spectacularly successful in changing the future of our country and opening up new possibilities. Easter week ended in military defeat. No other outcome was possible. But the rapid and overwhelming progress of the Republican cause in the following years and the dominance of constitutional republicanism since then makes the Irish Revolution one of the most successful and sustained in European history. It was a revolution fought with determination to create a democratic state, and it led to a state which was one of the very few in Europe to resist both fascism and communism in the last century. There is a lot to celebrate next year, and quite frankly, the last thing that is needed is political parties seeking to use the commemoration to promote contemporary political aims. This should be a moment for the people, and the proper role for politics in this is to facilitate remembrance and reflection. Too often in recent decades, 1916 has been abused in the service of current causes. First, anti-nationalist revisionism, and now the new revisionism of the provisional movement, have both sought to cynically misread the legitimate place of 1916 in our political discourse. This new revisionism of the provisionals is perhaps the single biggest barrier to an inclusive commemoration, promoting as it does a cynical rewriting of history and a campaign to legitimise a movement repeatedly rejected by the Irish people. So let's not have conferences full of politicians claiming that their manifestos represent the ideals of the proclamation, and let's not have grandiose plans claiming that they will somehow finally realise the vision of 1916. Instead, let's take up a bigger challenge. Let's show how we can continue the work of the men and women of 1916 to build a state which can set a vision for the future, how we can deliver a politics focused on the needs of Irish people today and the years ahead. Whatever way you look at this, the most important element is to have an election which allows a real and honest debate about the future. At some point before the main centenary events, there will be a general election. The Taoiseach says it will be held early next year, although Fine Gael has been revealed as researching the impact of holding it later this year. Whatever the date is, the government is already in the mode of permanent campaigning, with every word and every policy designed purely to help it win votes. Last week's so-called National Economic Dialogue once again reflected the government's debasement of language. The last thing which was involved was dialogue. It was a choreographed set piece for members of government to make exaggerated claims and position themselves for the election. While the Taoiseach and his ministers told us about how responsible and open they were, they continued to make promises of giveaways, and they set themselves up for yet again producing a dishonest budget. Last year they knew that a record-breaking supplementary provision was required for the Department of Health, yet the €600 million was kept out of the budget day figures. And this year Minister Varadkar is saying he will need another €1 billion, and you can be sure that this will be hidden on budget day as well. In fact, over the last 4 years, there has been a growing policy driven at cabinet level of publishing health spending plans which are known in advance to be misleading. Perhaps the most cynical thing we are seeing from the government is a policy of relaunching existing facilities in order to claim that something new is being done. And this has happened in every county and in the areas of health, education and enterprise. While those who casually reprint the press releases may be fooled by these tactics, the public clearly aren't. I believe that there's never been such a disconnect between political discourse and the attitudes of the public. The basic narrative which the government has worked so hard and often so successfully to sell to the media has been completely rejected by the public. Anyone who wants a positive election focused on the future of our country has to face the fact that Fine Gael in particular has no interest in this. They have already briefed constituencies that their electoral strategy will have two parts. First, there will be promises of lots of money on the way, and second, there will be an all-out negative campaign against the opposition. And this very much reflects Fine Gael's commitment to the British Tory election strategy. What they miss, of course, is that the Tories did not start so far behind, were not as unpopular, did not have scandals and crises such as injustice and health, and a water charge which is losing money and reducing funding for fixing pipes. There's also the small matter of whether Labour will continue to meekly accept that it should play the role of the Liberal Democrats. Following the Tory playbook, we can also be assured that Enda Kenny will try to limit the leaders' debates to a mass participation free-for-all where he can avoid being challenged on detail, and he will absolutely refuse to participate in any head-to-head debates. Thankfully, we have a far more participative democracy than the United Kingdom, and our electoral system is not receptive to the type of negative campaign which seems to be on the way. This is not to say that we have constructive campaigns. Research shows that with each successive election, media coverage has focused more on personality and the horse race element of campaigning. 2011 was one of the most consequential elections in our history, but there was very little real debate on the options for policy after the election. I think it is in part because the election was so focused on tactics and personalities that Fine Gael's not a red cent and Labour's way, not Frankfurt's way, was not fully scrutinised. It's also part of the reason why those parties so rapidly abandoned their policies and actually started claiming credit for policies they had voted and campaigned against. I believe we have an opportunity and a duty to deliver an election which actually discusses credible ways forward for our future. If we have another election where questions are focused on politics to the exclusion of substance, it will be another missed opportunity for our country. There's actually no difference. There is no actual difference between Gerry Adams' tell the Troika to go to hell and Labour's way or Frankfurt's way. It's well past time to commit to a debate about credible ways forward for our country. And as we know, the Taoiseach promised the abolition of the Seanad in advance of the last election. And I think it has to be said that the public appetite for throwaway initiatives such as that, designed to win a few headlines, has completely disappeared in the years since. A century after our most important founding event, there are a series of specific challenges facing us in public life, and they are what should dominate our election. First of all, we need a vision for the future of our economy, not just for the future of the budget. For example, the current enterprise strategy is a repackaged version of the one put in place a decade ago. There is no appreciation of the scale of the change, not just in our country, but in Europe and the wider world. We need an economy which works for all parts of our society, and we need a policy which recognises the huge pressures faced by towns and communities throughout the country. We are developing a two-tiered economy where many people are being left behind, and many people out there feel left behind. To tackle this and to open up the possibility of secure and well-paid employment to all, we have to first of all recognise the problem and then act. Investing in people and in ideas has to be taken more seriously. At its most basic, we have to give every child access to early education, to guidance and to counselling. We have to have a finance system which will support smaller enterprise, and we have to stop the hemorrhaging of scientific talent which has been directly caused by government policy. And that's an area that I'm particularly concerned about. people talk about short-termism and so on. Previous national development plans, and I was a Minister for Education when the programme for third level research, the first ever major investment in research emanating from the Department of Education, occurred in 98-99 with the help of Atlantic Philanthropies. And that was transformative in terms of its impact on research. It was long-term policy being put in place, followed by Science Foundation Ireland. And I was very concerned to read recently from scientists published in the Irish Times and Letters and so on, the absence of career pathways for young researchers and young scientists, the very stuff of a modern economy, the very basis, the engine, if you like, for the creativity that will create jobs into the future, in the future society. And we're in danger of losing that because of a very short-term approach to research that is overly focused and applied and ignored basic and pure research. And that's something that needs to change, and change quickly. We also need a vision for what the exact role of the state is in modern society. At the moment, it seems to me the only vision being offered is to go backwards, to run tax and spending policy in light of getting back to early 2008. There's no sense about what ambitions we have for the state and where we see its limits. What are the priorities and how can they be most equitably funded? And what's the role of the state in incomes policy? In terms of the emergence in certain sectors of the economy of low-wage sectors, low-hour contracts, zero-hour contracts. They're very real for significant elements of the economy and cannot be wished away. And you don't set a vision for the future in daily planted stories about tax cuts on the way. I believe that the Irish people want good, accessible and secure public services, and that they're willing to support them when shown that their money is being well used and that it is being levied fairly. Increasingly, they don't believe that taxes and charges are being levied fairly, and this is a major factor behind the discontent of the large middle ground. Ability to pay has to be an essential ingredient in terms of the cumulative impact of taxes and charges on people, and to date that hasn't been central to them. Also, setting out crude indicators about 50-50 splits doesn't address the question of what your vision for what is your vision for what the state does. It is incredible that probably for the first time in our history there's a white paper statement of policy objectives in place for only about 2 to 3 departments, particularly for one major service, and that's for compulsory health insurance. We have a white paper in terms of broad objectives in relation to compulsory health insurance, yet the Minister is abandoning the policy on a daily basis and refuses to acknowledge it, and won't publish the ESRI paper that they recently did in terms of the costings surrounding compulsory health insurance. Why won't the government? Why will the government not publish that document so we can have an informed debate on the options in terms of our health services? Given the scale of change in our country, there's a clear need to set out for each major public service a medium and long-term vision, a statement of objectives and priorities for public services, and a more progressive approach to taxation is a basic demand. And within this, we need a vision for how we are going to protect the idea of community within Irish society. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, community development has been dropped from ministerial responsibility. Urban and rural development schemes involving relatively small amounts of money have been abolished, and others have been neutered in what has been one of the most centralising periods of government since independence. And one just has to look at the LEADER programme, how that was undermined and how its autonomy was taken away from local communities as a perfect illustration of that. One of the key things which has helped us in these most difficult of times has been a community spirit. Often in the face of a system which they feel ignores them, communities have played an enormous social role. But if we take this for granted, it may not survive. And certainly there are areas of Dublin in particular where the removal of support for community activities is having a devastating impact. If you remove Garda stations, post offices, schools and even local representation from communities, and that's becoming a big issue, the abolition of urban district councils, and the impact of that is now being felt across the country, what is left? And don't forget, this is as much an issue in our cities as it is in rural areas. We need a clear vision for communities, one which sets out core standards for public services and which enables a coherent and long-term development strategy. We, of course, also need a vision for genuine political reform. We have published a comprehensive document, details of which are outlined at previous MacGill schools over the last 2 years. In recent years, there has been an aggressive centralisation of power into fewer and fewer offices. Cabinet itself has been marginalised, something the Taoiseach herself railed against until she became part of the inner circle. The government exercises a more complete control over parliamentary business than ever before. And while I acknowledge that debates had been limited in the past in certain circumstances, the scale of guillotines is unprecedented, as is the fact that core policies are being pushed through without debate or oversight. And the most classic illustration of that is the debate on the establishment of Irish Water. In almost all of its iterations legislatively, rushed through and rammed through the Dáil without any significant debate. Less information than ever is available through asking parliamentary questions, with the Taoiseach answering fewer questions than his predecessors. It has got to the stage where we are lodging freedom of information questions nearly every day in order to get basic information. The majority will should prevail in a parliament, but it should not be able to so easily shut down debate and exclude oversight. I believe that the first act of the next Dáil should be to begin to end this dominance by opening up key positions to all parties and reforming rules which allow ministers to obstruct basic accountability. Finally, I think we also have to have a vision for the future of this island as a whole. The historic victory of constitutional nationalism in 1998 created dramatic new possibilities for the people of this island. The men and women of violence were pushed into abandoning the reality and threat of violence, and an agreed framework for the future was ratified in referendums both north and south. The unfortunate reality is that the combination of two detached governments and an executive dominated by the obsessive self-interest of its two largest parties has squandered much of the potential. And this is a moment of clear crisis. It is not just a crisis about Tory welfare policies. It goes much deeper than this. Collapsing public engagement with politics in the north has been documented. Rising poverty. 46% of children are in poverty in West Belfast. And in 17 years, the last 17 years, Sinn Féin, for some reason, has never taken up an economic ministry. There's no point saying you're an anti-austerity party if you don't take the key positions that can turn that around and change that shocking statistic. And there's more shocking statistics in the north. And to me, the potential of the Good Friday Agreement to do something seriously about the marginalised and the disadvantaged in the north has not been grasped and remains, in my view, one of the most unsatisfactory follow-throughs of the agreement to date. Anyone who knows anything about our history knows that in the context of the north we can take nothing for granted, and we urgently need a new urgency in relation to Northern Ireland. A start should be a border regional development agency to protect and deliver on the economic and social potential in the border region. We need an end to tolerance of sectarian actions by parties, irrespective of who they are. Equality isn't a Trojan horse, as Gerry Adams said recently. It's a fundamental principle for the future of both parts of this island. The Irish people have not just shown endurance in the last 7 years. They've been actively engaged in public affairs. They've been deeply concerned with policy, and they have evolved very significantly in their beliefs. One of the many reasons why they have not bought into the government's narrative is that they can see that there is an obsession with presentation and short-term tactics. What is missing is a sense of where we want our country to be in the years ahead. In the election which will mark the centenary of our revolution, the single most fitting thing we could do as politicians is to understand this and to respond. Thank you very much indeed.